Rome after the Battle of Cannae. On August 2nd, 216 BC, Hannibal Barca destroyed a Roman army twice the size of his own in a single afternoon at Cannae, killing somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 men. It remains the bloodiest single day in Roman military history, and by any normal measure it should have ended the war outright. Rome had already lost two other major armies to Hannibal in the 2 years prior, at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, meaning an entire generation of Roman manpower had been wiped out in less than 3 years. There was no field army left standing between Hannibal and the city of Rome itself, and panic swept through the capital as survivors straggled home with news of the disaster. Any other ancient power would have opened negotiations immediately. Rome refused. The Senate banned public mourning outright, forbidding grieving families from wearing black or wailing in the streets, to project total unshaken resolve to both its own citizens and to Hannibal's spies watching the city. Slaves and condemned criminals were armed and enrolled into new legions, an almost unthinkable measure for a society built on rigid class distinctions. Rome adopted a new strategy under the general Fabius Maximus, nicknamed the Delaware. Never meet Hannibal in open battle again, just bleed him slowly for as long as it took, while he sat stranded deep in hostile Italian territory with no reinforcements, no siege equipment capable of taking Rome's walls, and no way to actually finish the war he had already won on the battlefield. Rome instead sent a young, ambitious general named Scipio to invade Carthage's territory in Spain and then North Africa directly, forcing Hannibal to abandon his hard-won position in Italy and rush home to defend his own capital. The two finally met at Zama in 202 BC, 14 long years after Cannae, and Scipio decisively destroyed him, ending the Second Punic War for good. Decades later, in exile in the court of a foreign king, Hannibal was reportedly asked by a Roman official, who he considered the greatest general in all of history. He ranked himself third, behind only Alexander the Great and Pyrrhus of Epirus. When the surprised official asked what he would have said had he actually beaten Scipio at Zama, Hannibal answered without hesitation that he would have placed himself first of all. George Washington crossing the Delaware. By December 1776, the Continental Army had collapsed from over 20,000 men earlier that year to fewer than 5,000, battered by a string of humiliating defeats around New York City that had cost Washington the city itself. Most enlistments were legally set to expire on New Year's Day, threatening to dissolve the entire army through simple attrition rather than combat, and the Continental Congress had already fled Philadelphia for Baltimore, quietly expecting the revolution to collapse within weeks. Morale among the remaining ragged, poorly supplied troops was as low as it had ever been. On Christmas night, George Washington made a desperate gamble to salvage what little momentum remained. He crossed the ice-choked Delaware River in complete darkness with roughly 2,400 men packed into flat-bottomed cargo boats, then marched them 9 grueling miles through a brutal nor'easter of driving sleet and snow, with several soldiers reportedly leaving bloody footprints in the snow from shoes that had worn through. At dawn on December 26th, they hit the Hessian garrison at Trenton completely by surprise, catching the mercenary soldiers still recovering from Christmas celebrations the night before. The battle was over in under an hour. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured for almost no losses on the American side, an astonishing and desperately needed victory after a year of near constant defeat. The Hessian commander, Colonel Johann Rall, was mortally wounded defending the town as his forces scrambled to respond. When his coat was searched afterward by American soldiers, they found a folded, unopened note tucked inside his pocket. It was a written warning about the coming attack, handed to him the night before by a loyalist informant who had somehow learned of Washington's plan. Rall had reportedly tucked the note away to read later during a card game and never got the chance to open it. The victory at Trenton, small in overall military scale, proved enormous in effect. It kept the revolution alive at its single lowest point and convinced enough wavering soldiers to re-enlist for another year, buying the fledgling cause the time it desperately needed to survive. Genghis Khan, rise from slavery. Temujin, the boy who would one day become Genghis Khan, was born around 1162 into a minor noble family on the harsh Mongolian steppe. When he was around 9 years old, his father was poisoned by rival Tatars at a feast under a false pretense of hospitality, and the clan that Temujin's family had depended on for protection abandoned his mother and siblings out on the open steppe to die, stripping them of their livestock and leaving them with almost nothing to survive the coming winter. The family reportedly survived those brutal years by foraging for wild roots, fishing, and hunting marmots, a stunning fall in status for a family that had once held real standing. As a teenager, Temujin was captured by a rival clan, the Taychid, and enslaved, fitted with a heavy wooden king locked around his neck specifically designed to prevent any attempt at escape. He broke free anyway, reportedly knocking out a guard with the same wooden device used to restrain him, and fleeing on foot alone across hostile, unfamiliar territory to eventually reach his family again. From that desperate low point, he began rebuilding, forging alliances through sheer force of personality and a reputation for personal loyalty, absorbing the followers of defeated rivals directly into his own ranks rather than simply slaughtering them as was custom, and slowly outmaneuvering every other claimant to power scattered across the steppe. He crushed his closest childhood friend turned greatest rival, Jamuka, in a prolonged and bitter struggle for dominance, and by 1206 had unified all of the fractured Mongol and Turkic tribes under a single rule for the first time in history, taking the title Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. What followed was the largest contiguous land empire ever assembled by a single conqueror in human history, eventually stretching from the Pacific coast of China all the way to the doorstep of Eastern Europe. The boy, once enslaved in a wooden collar, abandoned on the open steppe to starve alongside his mother and siblings, died in 1227 as the ruler of roughly 12% of the entire land area of planet Earth, and his exact burial site remains completely unknown to this day, deliberately hidden by his followers. Battle of Midway. 6 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan appeared genuinely unstoppable across the entire Pacific theater. The U.S. Navy had lost or crippled much of its battleship fleet in a single morning, and Japan's carrier task forces had swept unopposed from Southeast Asia all the way to the Central Pacific without suffering a single major defeat. In June 1942, Japan planned to seize the small American outpost of Midway Atoll and use it as bait to draw out America's few remaining aircraft carriers for one final, decisive battle intended to end U.S. naval power in the Pacific for good. What Japan didn't know is that American codebreakers working around the clock had already cracked enough of their naval communication code to know the exact target and the exact date of the coming attack well in advance. Admiral Chester Nimitz gambled everything on that intelligence, positioning 3 carriers, including the USS Yorktown, hastily patched together from severe battle damage in just 3 days of non-stop repair work that experts said should have taken months, to ambush a Japanese fleet that significantly outnumbered them and had no idea they were coming. The morning of June 4th began disastrously for the Americans. Wave after wave of obsolete American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese carriers head-on and were slaughtered almost to the last aircraft, achieving nothing but the deaths of their crews. But their doomed sacrifice inadvertently pulled Japanese fighter cover down to sea level at exactly the wrong possible moment. Minutes later, American dive bombers arrived high overhead, completely unopposed, and caught 3 Japanese carriers with their flight decks packed full of fuel-armed aircraft mid-rearmament for a planned second strike. In under 6 catastrophic minutes, all 3 carriers were transformed into floating infernos beyond saving. A 4th Japanese carrier was hunted down and sunk hours later that same day. Japan lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers and hundreds of its most experienced, hard-to-replace pilots in a single afternoon, a blow from which its navy never truly recovered for the rest of the war, permanently shifting the entire balance of power in the Pacific. Emperor Heraclius, saving Byzantium. In 610 AD, Heraclius seized the Byzantine throne of an empire that was already effectively dying around him. The Persian Sassanid Empire had ruthlessly exploited years of crippling Byzantine civil war and instability to tear through the richest provinces of the East almost unopposed, capturing Syria, then Egypt, and finally Jerusalem itself in 614, where Persian forces seized the True Cross, the empire's single holiest relic, and carried it off in triumph as a war trophy. By 626, Constantinople itself lay under direct siege, surrounded simultaneously on land by a massive Persian army, and by sea by allied Avar forces, with the empire's total and final collapse seeming to many at the time to be only a matter of weeks. Heraclius made an extraordinary and deeply risky decision. Rather than remain to defend the capital directly as tradition demanded, he stripped church treasuries across the empire to fund a desperate new army and personally led it deep into the Persian heartland, striking directly at the enemy's own home territory, while his own capital city sat under siege behind him, with no guarantee it would survive his absence. It was a gamble that could have permanently lost the empire outright had Constantinople fallen while he was away. It held. Heraclius pushed relentlessly through Persian Mesopotamia and won a decisive war-ending victory at the Battle of Nineveh in 627, shattering the main Persian army and triggering the collapse of the regime of the Persian king Khosrow, who was overthrown and executed by his own son shortly afterward in the chaos. In 629, Heraclius personally carried the recovered True Cross back into Jerusalem on foot, reportedly walking barefoot through the city gates himself in a dramatic public act of humility and gratitude, completing one of the single most dramatic military and political reversals in the entire history of the ancient world. Within barely a decade, both of these utterly exhausted empires would be overrun in turn by a sudden new power neither one had ever anticipated: the fast-moving armies of the early Islamic conquests. Napoleon's 100 Days. In April 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte was forced to abdicate his throne and was exiled to the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba, stripped of his vast European empire, and left ruling a token kingdom of a few thousand subjects under the close watch of Allied ships specifically stationed to keep him contained there for good. Less than a year later, on February 26, 1815, he slipped past the British naval patrol under cover of darkness with fewer than 1,000 loyal soldiers and landed quietly on the French coast. What followed was almost entirely bloodless. Regiment after regiment sent by the newly restored French king to intercept and arrest him instead marched over and joined his ranks the very moment they laid eyes on him, refusing direct orders from their own officers to open fire. At one now famous encounter near Grenoble, Napoleon reportedly walked forward alone toward a nervous line of soldiers sent to stop him, dramatically opened his coat to bare his chest, and calmly told them to shoot their emperor if that was truly what they wished to do. They threw down their weapons on the spot and cheered wildly for him instead. 20 days after landing with less than 1,000 men and no artillery, Napoleon walked back into Paris in triumph and reclaimed the French throne without a single major battle ever being fought. His restored reign lasted exactly 100 days. A fresh coalition of horrified European powers mobilized immediately to crush him once and for all, and on June 18, 1815, Napoleon was decisively and finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium, ending the fastest and most dramatic return to power in all of modern history almost as suddenly as it had begun. He was exiled a second time, this time to the remote and inescapable South Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he died 6 years later in 1821. And historians continue to argue to this very day over whether he was slowly poisoned during those final lonely years. Battle of Stalingrad. By late summer 1942, Nazi Germany's Sixth Army had fought its way deep into the industrial city of Stalingrad, reducing much of it to smoking rubble in some of the most brutal, close-quarters urban combat of the entire war, with the front lines eventually collapsing down to individual buildings, stairwells, and even single rooms fought over for days at a time. Adolf Hitler, personally obsessed with capturing the city that bore his rival Stalin's name for propaganda purposes, refused to authorize any tactical retreat even as Soviet forces began quietly massing enormous reserves on the exposed flanks outside the city, positions guarded by comparatively weaker Romanian and Hungarian allied units rather than experienced German troops. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive coordinated pincer attack that tore straight through those weaker flanking forces and completely encircled the entire German Sixth Army inside the ruined city within just 4 days. Roughly 250,000 German and Axis soldiers found themselves suddenly trapped with winter closing in. Hitler forbade any breakout attempt whatsoever, insisting the army hold its exposed position and be resupplied entirely by air, a logistical promise the overstretched German Air Force could never come remotely close to fulfilling. Trapped through a brutal Russian winter with dwindling ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies, the starving, freezing German force held on for months while Soviet forces steadily tightened the encirclement around them. General Friedrich Paulus finally surrendered on January 31, 1943, in direct and explicit defiance of Hitler's standing order to fight to the very last man and bullet. Of roughly 91,000 German soldiers taken prisoner at Stalingrad, only about 5,000 ever returned home years later, the vast majority dying in brutal Soviet captivity in the years that followed. The battle is widely considered by historians to be the single decisive turning point of the entire Eastern Front, the exact moment Germany's seemingly unstoppable advance into the Soviet Union finally broke and never recovered again.